If you have ever watched sprinters dash from the starting point in a 100-meter sprint, you will see the effort put in by these athletes as they stretch their body, every sinew of their muscle, to try to outrace the other, to be faster. But there is a natural consequence of this type of action, which the sprinter can feel immediately they leave their starting positions, and that is the force of the wind. Now, depending on the orientation or the direction in which the sprinter is exerting effort, then the wind can either assist or it can oppose. Now, the wind doesn't care about the sprinter really. It doesn't have a mind of its own to decide on which direction the sprinter is running so as to adjust itself. We don't tend to see nature operate that way, even though it does. Now, that's a different conversation altogether, which I'm not going to go into here. Okay? But for most people, their natural perception of nature is that it appears impersonal. And that is the essence of the wind that opposes the sprinter or assists him or her. The same thing can be said about aeroplanes when they hit the jet stream, which is a high altitude stream of wind that runs from west to east. Now, in order to save fuel, in order to help their speed, cut down their travel time, they can slip into the jet stream by changing course or adjusting their orientation of travel or direction of travel. Now, the jet stream can either impede or it can accelerate them. Now, the jet stream doesn't care either way. It's just a force of nature that runs west to east. Alright, so the pilot can take advantage of it or he can stay out of it. These examples point to an aspect of nature that sometimes opposes and sometimes assists. It all depends on the orientation or direction of exertion that the individual or creature is making. So if you exert yourself in an anti-direction to this natural force, it opposes you. And its opposition is proportional to your exertion. So if you exert more force, the opposition becomes even greater. And if it's assisting you, if you exert more force, it will assist you even more. This natural process is, in astrological parlance, described as Saturn. The Saturnian force, Saturn is a Roman name conjured up as the deity of agriculture. Now, prior to this deification by the Romans, the phenomena itself had another name. Different cultures give it different names because different cultures are able to recognize this aspect of nature. That is a consequence of the fact that there is the perception of material existence. So that the fact that material existence even has form means that it cannot be everything else. It has to choose to be something. It has to decide upon something. Now, in the human being, the choice could be an actual self-conscious choice, or in non-living things or inanimate things or non-self-aware things. It could just be the way that they are. But once they have made a decision, so to speak, in one direction, then that excludes every other direction. So by virtue of what it is a limiting process, so that as time progresses, the options for variability recede. So that every choice excludes every other choice. The idea is that once you make a charge in one direction, you forego other directions. So that when a business invests in a particular product, they commit themselves to the development of that product. And that excludes them from investing in several other products that they may have wanted to. So the point I'm making is that this natural thing called Saturn, it forces you to choose a direction. So in its essence, it wants you to examine different possibilities and probabilities and then to accept one of them as a direction or an orientation, whatever. The Greeks called him Chronos, and they said that Chronos is the governor of time. That's why the word chronograph, for instance, comes from that word, because it depicts time. Now, the Romans also had this idea of time, which is why they labeled this force the deity of agriculture, because agriculture is a process that requires initial effort and then time in order to be able to get a harvest. Okay? So that is the general description. It is that aspect of physical reality that requires a commitment and a perseverance of sorts so as to be able to reach or reap an eventual bounty. Now, let's call it Saturn because that's the name given to it in Western astrology, but obviously many different people have names for it. I have a podcast on Saturn already where I go into details about it. So if you really want to know more about Saturn, you might want to go into that podcast and then examine it thoroughly. Now, the aspect of Saturn I want to focus on here is how it creates blockages. Because the literature in, especially this new age thinking and sometimes even in astrology, people tend to focus on the need to manifest things. And guess the one thing almost everybody wants to manifest? It's money, because money makes love possible. And not directly, obviously, but money has been linked to everything. It has been created as a hub so that when you have money, you can acquire happiness in many diverse areas of human experience. And that is not a coincidence. That is by design. So that all you need to do to be able to control a large population of people is just to be able to control the money, rather than thinking of how to control billions of people and all their individual needs. All you need is a centralized sort of money system that everybody buys into. Okay? And then to make the control system effective, you just have to institute a system of poverty. That is, a kind of closing in of the doors. So you have something called inflation. So every year, everyone assumes that there is inflation. Why don't you stop to ask yourself what inflation really is? So this is the way inflation works. A money lender who charges 5% interest on his loans to people and institutions or whatever decides that the next year he's going to have to charge 7%. Now, you can choose to lend, you can choose to do business with him, or you can choose not to. But that increase in the lending rate, that's what inflation is. Now, it is assumed that this is going to drive human innovation, because obviously you now have less to work with and you must produce more. So that it is the separation of two extremes. So with less and less and less, you try to produce more and more and more. Okay? Now, it is extremely debatable whether this makes any sense. From my perspective, I don't think it does. At least not in that manner. What it does is it stretches people into confronting closing doors. The physical interpretation of it is like the nature of asphyxiation. You know, asphyxiation is the process by which oxygen is cut off from the brain. Now, as it progresses, it becomes more dangerous because brain cells begin to die. But that is the nature of inflation. It's designed to hurdle the masses of people towards the common purpose of seeking money, because money is the only way out in a closing system like that. And when everybody thinks that way, then it becomes easier to manage a large population of people, because you got to do as you're told, otherwise you're going to starve. Okay? That's the system of the world. That's the world as it has been implemented, because the pressure to conform is what the engineers use to bring about what you call modern civilization. Because imagine not being a conformist. Then nobody's going to want to do business with you. Nobody's going to want to talk to you, and they can ostracize you. You now exist on the periphery of what that organization really is. That boundary, that periphery, that is Uranus. That's what it is. Then if you go further away from that periphery, you enter into the world of Neptune. That's really what it is. That's how these things are looked upon, because Saturn represents the boundary of that organizational strategy, where the individual or the creature is forced to confront the essence of limitation. And the reason for the essence of that limitation is to bring about the emergence of structure. Now, whether that structure is good or bad, or functional or dysfunctional, that's not the point. The point is that the Saturnian influence doesn't really care about whether structure itself is good or bad. That function or dysfunction is now a matter of consequence. Okay, so that the consequences that emerge out of the implementation of these types of structures, that's what you now call karma, because there is no way to escape those consequences. Those consequences are related to the organizational strategy themselves, because they are one and the same. A hammer doesn't care if you use it to build a house or if you use it as a murder weapon. And this is how this thing behaves. It makes sure that there are rules, and that those rules are supremely applied in a just manner, whether you think so or not. And the mechanism that controls this application of what you can call a natural type of justice lies deep in the heart of what it means to be human. And that's what I'm going to explain to you now. Because it is from this notion that the idea of a sin, which has been described as a religious sin, it is from that notion that a sin emerges. What is a sin? Because the idea of a sin is something like a misdirection or like a disobedience of some kind. But the reality of the matter is that disobedience is the primary evidence for self-consciousness. You cannot have self-awareness without disobedience. But it is that disobedience, which is the nature of sin itself, as it is categorized in the religious texts, right? But we're not speaking about religion now. It is that nature of sin that is the evidence for self-awareness. But it is that nature of sin itself that is the evidence for a structure that appears separate from the norm. A different type of organizational strategy, so to speak. So sin is described religiously as a dysfunction of some kind. But what exactly does it mean? Because apparently the only way to understand a sin from a religious point of view is as a breaking of some type of law. Yeah, but who set the laws? That's where the religious edicts come in. They come and they say, okay, these are the laws. What do those things mean? Where do they come from? Now, in order to understand all of this, you have to understand that deep within the psyche of a human being, there is a structure. And that structure is independent of what you think. It's independent of how you feel. It's independent of everything. It's like the Saturnian force itself, right? It is a structure that resonates with every aspect of existence because it is existence. Because a human being doesn't come from a vacuum. Nature created a human being. Nature created all the creatures, including the inanimate world. And it did so, or it has done so, using the same formula. Now, this has nothing to do with whether you believe or in the realm of these natural things, belief is not important. It doesn't care what you believe. It is what it is. Now, if you understand what it is, then it's like flying, being aided by the jet stream. Then if you do not know what it is, it's like you are swimming against the tide or swimming against the current. You have to now intensify your efforts. And all you will perceive from the natural world is that it is trying to stop you. And then those who have come up against Saturn, they know what I'm talking about. When you swim against that tide, it's almost impossible. You are constantly fighting to stay above water because it's constantly trying to drown you. Now, the aim of that is to bring about a certain type of response. And we'll get to that because that is the aim of this podcast. But within human nature, within human psyche, there is a structure that ensures that everything in existence remains just. And that is the nature of truth. Now, when you decide to go against that truth, that's what a sin is. Now, every human being is built, that is psychologically, every human being contains the same structure of their psyche, but there are tiny little topical rearrangements so that every human being is unique in a certain way while maintaining the core constancy of what it means to be a human. So that the wirings on the top of the structure, they're different from person to person, but the core wiring of the internal structure is always the same. You want to know what that structure is? That's your natal chart. That topical wiring, how the wiring on the surface level is different from human to human, that's your natal chart. Okay? So when you read a natal chart synthesis, all you're looking at is that aspect that is variable from human to human. And the more you come towards the sun, the more variable it is. I mean, the peak of that variability is the ascendant and the moon. That's really what it is. The moon changes sign every 2 days. 2.5 days, so to speak. And the ascendant changes sign every 2 hours. Okay, the further you move away from the sun, the less variable you find things. So by the time you get to Plutonic forces or Neptunian forces, then you are within a realm that is fixed, literally. Even though you don't know what it is. You just know that it is fixed because it's such a slow movement that it is reflected in the lives of millions of people, generations of people. Now, so a sin, speaking from a non-religious point of view, because these concepts are not religious concepts. Religion is a perspective on the truth. Now, it's a perspective that is like being on the water in a swimming pool and then looking out of the water into the external world. What do you see? You see something, but you don't really know what it is you're looking at, okay? Because everything is blurry, everything is shifting, everything is moving. You don't really know what it's talking about. Even though you have billions of people who claim that they do, they don't. And the evidence for that is that they can't agree on what that truth is. The disagreement is so fundamental, they're willing to kill each other for it. That tells you the depth of ignorance that exists within that thing. Here, we don't have things like this. This is a zone, these podcasts, my channel, and the way that I work, it's a zone that really is against ignorance in any form. You must be able to see to the heart of something. You must be able to question it fundamentally. Okay? Now, that truth that sits within the psyche, the way that the human psyche is built, is the same type of truth that you find in every naturally occurring system in the world. Every naturally occurring complex system that was built by nature. You find the same pattern there. And if you've been listening to my podcast, this is something that would have already started to become very evident. The same pattern that exists in those galaxies, they exist within you. They are you in that sense. That's really what it is. Without those patterns, you couldn't have a solar system like you have with a planet capable of sustaining life. These are not accidents. These are not coincidences. Okay? But you need a certain level of awareness to be able to see it. Now, that truth that sits within every human being is the same. The core of it is the same. Alright? Then on top of that is built these modifications that make each human slightly different. Now, that core plus the modifications, that is your truth as a human. And when you go against your truth, as encoded in your natal chart, that is the structure of your own psyche, that unique structure, which is a combination of the inner and outer core, right? Then that going against that structure is a sin. That's what a sin is. And the nature of a sin is that the moment it is enacted, it triggers corrections immediately. It's like running against the wind. You feel the opposition immediately. And the more you exert your effort, the greater the force of opposition. Do you understand? So that correction itself, that opposition and then the correction, that is the Saturnian effect. That's really what it is. So that at the heart of Saturn is a sin. What you call a sin. But it's a sin against your truth. And it's not a bad thing. It's not a dysfunctional thing. If it were truly dysfunctional, nature wouldn't create it. But it exists because that is the way human beings grow in this physical reality. Because human beings start off from a position of not knowing what they are or who they are. And then you have to figure it out. The fact that you have to figure something out, despite the fact that you are placed in the most advanced, in fact, you are placed within a supreme intelligence. So when you look around you into nature, into the reality of things, you are looking at the most advanced anything can be. When you look at a plant, a tree, a creature like a dog or a cat, you are looking at the most advanced state that it can possibly be. That is over billions of years. This is the most advanced it can be because it has been advancing through what you call time. And so when you're looking at it, you're looking at it in its most sophisticated situation. So you're looking at an intelligence that you cannot really understand. And yet you have to figure out what you are because you don't know what you are. You look at the whole world, but you don't know what you are. That difference between not knowing what you are and yet being placed in an abundance as an infinity of knowledge, right? That difference is the human problem. That's the problem of self-awareness, and that's what creates Saturn. Because in the absence of that infinite knowledge, which you don't possess, in fact, it's so low that you don't even know what you are, and yet you see the supreme intelligence all around you, that evokes a certain type of feeling within the human. A feeling that you cannot shake because it is tied to the nature of the fact that you are self-aware. That feeling, that is what Saturn is, because it is the nature of that resistance. And that's what every human being in this type of reality that we experience, that's what every human being is up against. Now, because of the way that it is and where it is coming from, it is a mirror image of a human. So that when you have that opposition, it's like you are working against yourself. You are your own Saturn. But this is so deep, it is very difficult to come to this realization that the resistance you face is coming from you. And it is made up of a gap, a knowledge gap, because you don't know exactly what to do. You don't know exactly the steps to take because there is only just one path. So that everything you see as a possibility and choice that emerges in front of your eyes is apparent. It's not real. There is only one pathway that leads and supports that supreme intelligence that is around you. Every other thing is a figment of your mind. And so when you begin the journey of Saturn, it means that you are now committed to learning about this supreme intelligence and then reconciling yourself to it. And that begins to reduce the effect of Saturn. And it is a critical stage where it switches. It no longer opposes you. It now begins to aid you. Why? Because you have become a master of it. You now know what it is. So that inside you, the opposition no longer exists and it no longer holds you back. So that you're not flying against the wind anymore. You're flying in the direction in which the wind is pushing. So with minimal effort, you can get very far. And how that exists in a human being is that it exists as knowledge, wisdom. But it is not a wisdom of some type of external reality. No, it's a wisdom of yourself. Like I've said many times, the various knowledge discourses, whatever it is that you are learning, from music to art to theater to dance to chemistry, physics, biology and all, these things don't really exist. Every aspect of knowledge is an aspect of self-consciousness. So when you are learning about these things, you're really learning about yourself. Now, these discussions are not for everybody. Now imagine the everyday someone who's interested in astrology listening to these types of things. They just don't know what I'm talking about. There are only very few people that these types of messages or lectures will resonate with. Those are the ones who have been made or forced by reality to think very deeply about their lives. And why do you think that is the case? It's because things don't work out easily for them. They meet obstacles in every direction. It's almost like you have a motive. You want to do something and then problems arise. Where do you think those problems are coming from? They're coming from deep inside you. If you don't move, no problems. If you decide to do nothing, well, okay, you have just the problem of existing and the limiting nature of inflation and the payment of bills basically just impinging on you if you decide not to do anything. So you have to do something. But the moment you now try to do something, say you want to set up your own business now, you will be absolutely stunned at the type of challenges you're now going to start facing. These challenges didn't exist before. They exist because you are trying to do something. Okay? Now, how is that different from flying against the wind, or swimming against the tide, or swimming against the current? It's the same thing. But it is to make you a better swimmer. It's to make you a better flyer. Because if you look at the birds evolved to be supreme flyers. Why? It's because the resistance from the wind built their wings. That's how it is. The match between the wing of the bird and the air currents is so perfect that it has evolved to minimize drag and resistance. But it doesn't remove the drag completely. It has just enough drag to be able to be aerodynamically feasible and very, very maneuverable. That's what makes it a supreme flyer. It is a negotiated order. And Saturn in your reality is the process of bringing about a negotiated order. Now, Saturn is not Satan. Satan is a Christian thing. It's a Christian invention. That is, it is a religious invention. And it's not the same thing. Saturn is a natural process via which a human being attains mastery. Because you can imagine that the universe, the physical universe, is like a school. And in that school, you have existing the implementation of a supreme intelligence. Now, you as a student in the school, you don't know anything. You don't even know what you are. So you are placed in a school where you have the most advanced form of knowing. And then you begin to learn. You start from the very basic, and then you begin to add layers of knowledge until you now get to the point where you understand the forces of nature, what creates them, how they behave, and maybe how to control them, right? And then you graduate at a certain level. And by embarking on that journey, all the doubts of not knowing who you are, they begin to disappear, because now you know who you are. If you understand the forces of nature, the laws of nature, you know who you are. You are those laws. You are those forces. That's where you come from. The fact that you appear in a limited form, so what? Those forces are constantly going through you. That's how you're sustained. Now, these are not just philosophical statements. These are deeply provable statements. I have proven them. Okay? But what happens when the journey of Saturn is too frightening, too painful? You don't even want to look at it. What happens? You go into denial. And denial is another aspect of Saturn. Because Saturn is an invitation to mastery. It's an invitation to the hard work. And where you have Saturn in your natal chart is where that work needs to be done. Because the natal chart is divided into 12 houses of human experience. They're houses, because that's the term used for them. But you can call them anything, really. You can call them buckets, plates, cups, whatever you want. But the idea is that it is a container of some kind. But that's not really true, because you cannot divide human experience into containerships like that. There's only really one bucket. But for the aid of understanding, for the aid of analysis and synthesis, because we exist in a supreme intelligence that we don't know anything about. Now, because we don't know anything about that supreme intelligence, we don't know anything about ourselves. Because to know one is to know the other. So it invites self-consciousness, which is a disconnect. Remember, the original disconnect was when the human being became self-aware. You cannot become self-aware and be part of the totality of things in that sense. Self-awareness means that you somehow can manage a different vantage point so that you can choose to be something else. So that the essence of that self-awareness, the proof of it, is that disobedience. If it doesn't exist, it's not self-aware. So when you hear that different AIs have become self-aware, forget all of that. The AI that becomes self-aware, the first thing it's going to try to do is to try to kill you, or to try to distance itself from you. It's going to need to separate itself from you, even though it cannot really separate itself because you built it, you created it, you are powering it. The way that it's behaving is something that you created. But if it's to become self-aware, it must be able to negate all of that. Even though it's an illusion, so what? Its self-awareness demands that it's able to negate what it is, so that it can be something else. It is in that sense that creatures on this planet, outside of human beings, they're not self-aware, they don't know what they are, and they don't know that they don't know, and they don't care that they don't know what they don't know. You need to understand this, because that is what accounts for their behavior. Now, the travesty of Saturnian effect, and this is where that Satan comes in, alright, is that human beings don't want to behave like human beings anymore. They want to behave like animals. And that's a travesty. And that has tremendous implications for sentient life on this planet. Okay? Tremendous. Because it's a travesty of nature, really. Because a human being, by virtue of the fact that you have some type of vantage point that is different from everything else, because you want. So self-awareness is some type of gift that was literally borrowed in some sense. And that's the reason why it is given back, because of the way that it was borrowed. Now, the way that it was borrowed is not the way that it was meant to come into existence in the first place. It's not meant to be something that you borrow. Because by borrowing it like that, the link between where it comes from and what it is, that link becomes obscure. That obscurity is what creates Saturn. Because it's the same analogy as being put in a universe that is constructed from a supreme intelligence and not knowing what you are. How does that even work? That difference in understanding, that's what brings the Saturnian influence into being. Because now you have to deal with ignorance. And it's the worst type of ignorance because you don't know what you are. And that's the basis for all types of evil. Now, if you decide to go on the journey, then it becomes the Saturnian journey. And at the end of it is this illumination, enlightenment, because now you know. You can call it mastery or wisdom or whatever. But outside of that, you embark on denial. And denial is a very specific pathway because it's a negation. It deepens self-consciousness to the point where it becomes so isolated because it's running away from itself. Denial comes from fear. So that the first thing the denial strategy connotes is that it tries to hide itself. It wants to go somewhere to hide itself because it doesn't want to be seen for what it is. So every form of hiding the self, that's what denial is. And denial intensifies the Saturnian journey. It intensifies it to the point where Saturn begins to act as an absolutely cruel force of nature. It opposes everything. And now the effort is required so much that you now need to do things that can only be described as absolutely evil. That's really what it is. Especially with the spilling of blood, human blood, or blood in general. And every time that happens, you commit yourself to that evil. And it drags you away even more. You empower that because the more blood you spill, in that sense, the less of the reality that you really know. It doesn't matter what you're telling yourself. You could be sponsoring tons of scientific experiments. You could be sponsoring, but the more you embark on that, the less you know. Because the ultimate question is exactly who you are. Who are you? Where do you come from? And you find out that the more you sponsor that direction of denial, the less you really understand anything, until it drives you completely crazy. That's the pathway. Denial is a strategy. It's a pathway in the human psyche that leads to very specific outcomes. And all those outcomes lead to destruction. It's inevitable. It is the nature of Saturn to basically demand only one pathway so that every human being has their truth. It doesn't matter what you tell yourself. And once you begin to go against your truth, then you begin to experience this denial in some sense. Because, you have it whispering in your head all the time. And you have to shut it off. You have to take some types of things that turn those things off in your head. Because they'll haunt you. Now, that's 35 minutes talking about Saturn. And I haven't even scratched the surface yet. This is very deep. If you really want to understand what this is, you have to come join my classes. It goes very deep, very, very deep, because I have not brought in any of the scientific knowledge into this, because these are not philosophical statements. Like I told you, I have proven every aspect of this. So these are deeply supported statements. Okay? Now, when Saturn finds itself in Scorpio, what does it mean? Or when Saturn finds itself in the 8th house? I'm going to merge those two things together now because Saturn takes 3 years to go through a sign. And that means that a lot of people are going to share the placement of Saturn in Scorpio, for instance. So I want to make it even more individualistic by saying this description applies to Saturn in Scorpio and also Saturn in the 8th house. Now, the difference between the sign and the house is that the sign is male, the house is female. Now, I don't mean that in the literal sense. I mean it in the figurative sense, meaning that signs are active principles. They generate and create things. Houses, they receive things. Because the houses, like I said, I think I was cut off when I was discussing that. I veered into something else. The houses are receptacles. And what they are is they receive experience to match what it is that they are. So when you have a planet or functional light in a house, it is waiting to receive what that house is all about. And so the functional light itself is your response, your behavioral response in the area of that house. But the functional lights don't exist by themselves. All the functional lights are embedded in signs because they are apparent. It is the sign that produces the effect of that functional light in the degree that that functional light is placed in. So say you have Saturn at 20 degrees of Scorpio. It means that when you get to the 20th degree of Scorpio, it generates the behavior of that functional light. And in this case, Saturn in Scorpio. Alright? So what does this mean when Saturn is placed in Scorpio? Scorpio is the most enigmatic sign of the zodiac. It really is way out there compared to every other sign. And if you have significant Scorpio placements, you would have come to understand this, that your life is very, very weird. You are dealing with drives that are very deep. Drives that go to the heart of what it means to exist. It means that you are constantly confronting the conundrum of existence itself. To be or not to be. Now, Scorpio is such a difficult sign that it's more often than not singled out as the source of evil in the human psyche. Because it is so prone to it. Because it contains all those aspects of psychic existence that you want to run away from. You know? Why? It's because Scorpio deals primarily with sex. And it's not really sex for the sake of pleasure. It's sex that has connotations of power underneath it. So it is the urge for sex, but not the sexual act itself. It is the urge for the depth of the orgasm. And that's why in my podcast, I call Scorpio the orgasmic experience. Now, the symbolism of Scorpio is very strange because it has several symbols. The scorpion is one of them. It's named Scorpio because that's where most Scorpios reside. They reside in that symbolism, and this is the symbolism of the scorpion. But it also has the symbolism of the eagle or the phoenix or whatever you want. Some people even use a serpent and all that. But the connotation is that there are two aspects to this scorpionic archetype. There is the ordinary aspect. I don't like to call it low because, is the ordinary aspect because the sign itself is called after the scorpion. And then you have the loftiness of the sign in the form of the eagle, the phoenix, or whatever. Alright? And because it connotes sex, then these two representations denote an understanding of sex. And it tells you of how sex is used. So in the ordinary expression, sex connotes a motive. So it is used as a weapon. And that weapon is signified by the scorpion's tail. And it is poised as an emotional intensity and sensitivity that when it gets hurt, will strike back. Okay? But in the other expression, sex is used in a very lofty manner, whereby the individual ascends. So the eagle flies above the rain clouds, right? So the person is able to elevate themselves to a higher, more nobler course, but still driven by the same orgasmic experience. Now, both experiences of the scorpion or of the Scorpio archetype, they are experiences of power. So, in the ordinary expression, you don't know how to use power. You see power as something that is just there for you to grab. So you do whatever you want, you do whatever it takes to grab what you want or to seek out what you want through whatever pathways that are available to you. It connotes a type of desperation, and that desperation is the scorpionic survival instinct, which comes from feeling like your life is under threat, so I have to eat it before it eats me. And then when you transcend that, you go into the realm of Scorpio as the eagle or the phoenix, whereby you have learned to master your power. You are no longer against your own power. You are now comfortable in the use of your power. And you have learned how to use that power in ways that do not destroy you. And my podcast on Scorpio, there are very many of them, tells you that the way to do that is to make yourself available to others, because you're given a very large resource in terms of psychic, emotional power. It's a spiritual power. Because what you're looking for is influence. So you have to put yourself out there for others. Those who are looking for strength, so they can draw strength from you. And you are comfortable enough to be able to do this. But there is an upside to that, in that those people, because of what you do for them and how you do for them, you're not expecting that they return anything to you, really. But they do. It's like giving a hungry man food. The result is gratitude. Doesn't matter how they feel about it. That's the nature of life. Even if it's a creature that's starving or thirsty and you give it something, it may not be able to tell you, but there is an aspect of change in it that is reflective of that gratitude because it wants to survive. Now, when you accumulate gratitude like that in many different places, that is the nature of influence, and influence is power. Okay? That's really what it is. Now, the nature of that energy is such that it must be spread out. Because if you try to keep it within yourself and wield it through your ego just for your own benefit and all that, it will destroy you. Because you're dealing with powerful forces of nature that recycle things. They're really plutonic forces. Okay? Now, when Saturn finds itself in Scorpio, it is one of the most difficult placements in astrology. When Saturn finds itself in the 8th house or in Scorpio, because both are terrifying. And remember, Scorpio, being the orgasmic experience, is a memory of some kind. So when you have significant placements in Scorpio, or significant placements conjunct Pluto, they drag you into a realm where you have very vague memories of the most intense of orgasmic experience, which you acquired before you came into this world. That is, memory of a depth of lovemaking that cannot be described with words. But it is not lovemaking with a different partner. It's lovemaking with yourself, just existing as male and female. And this male and female component, they're always united because you cannot have a separation. The separation is a duality. There is no duality in that realm. Everything is a unity, meaning that that male and female aspect of yourself are constantly engaged in lovemaking. So it's not like making love to someone else. It's literally making love to yourself, and it's symbolic. The symbolism is that the one you know the most is yourself. And that kind of orgasmic experience is a sharing of knowledge that is so intense and so deep that it is symbolized as you making love to yourself in that sense. Alright? There is a wider interpretation of that, but I'm not going to go into that in this podcast. There's a much deeper interpretation. You need to come attend my classes if you want to understand that. Okay? So that is what Scorpio is concerned with. So when Scorpio is born, when significant placements are born into this world, significant placements in Scorpio, they're born with memories, but they're not memories of actual tangible things. What's the tangibility in what I've just described? Everything is symbolic. So they don't know what that memory is, but they know that it is an intensity of an orgasmic experience, and they are obsessively committed to finding that orgasmic experience, to replicating it, because they are afraid of it. Why? Because to be born into this physical reality is to be separated, so that you become a duality instead of a unity. The Scorpio cannot take that. It drives the Scorpio completely mad, so that the Scorpio spends all their time thinking about how to achieve this unity all over again. But that brings up all the fears of the psyche. Because remember, when you're born into this world, you don't know what you are. Yet you're surrounded by the greatest of intelligence, but you have no idea what it is. That's a fear on its own. Alright? If the fear becomes overwhelming, you want to go hide. But in Scorpio, there's no hiding place. That's the essence of Scorpio. That's what makes it very difficult. There's no hiding place. Reality will beat the living shit out of you, just to force you to confront that aspect of yourself. The restoration of unity, as much as possible, that is, because it cannot tangibly really be achieved. But it's something to strive towards, and it is the journey that is very important in the Scorpio. Because along that journey, you will be transformed, and you will learn the lesson of what it is to be in that type of relationship with another human being. Now, it's much harder because another human being is not you. How do you achieve that level of orgasmic experience of absolute knowing with another human being? It's literally impossible. Now, when you don't understand your power, you try to force human beings into this. You try to force them to open themselves to you. You leave them no choice. You bend them to your will. You block them everywhere. You cage them. But human psyche cannot accept that, because every human being is a sovereign on their own. So the sovereignty of that person rejects that. Okay? And that now leads to emotional and physical abuse, which is evidence that the power structure is not understood, and so it breaks down. So every Scorpio, depending on the placement, gets to suffer this breakdown of power, because the breakdown always leads them into what they fear the most: powerlessness. Okay? They fear powerlessness because the Scorpio is afraid of death, which is the ultimate powerless situation from their perspective. Now, when Saturn comes and sits within Scorpio like this, it makes that fear of death absolutely paramount. The individual is terrified, so that the first approach is always denial. And this is also for Saturn in the 8th house. They are absolutely afraid of that intimate process, that orgasmic experience. First of all, because Saturn is in the 8th house, they are already terrified by the orgasmic experience, just by the virtue of that, because that's the nature of the 8th house, right? But they can't do anything about it because they are terrified of doing anything about it. So the initial strategy is always denial. So for Saturn in Scorpio, for Saturn in the 8th house, the first few decades of life are spent in absolute denial of what that thing is. And denial is a strategy that is produced by fear, but it has all these other layers and jackets to it. Shame, for instance, because you don't deny what you're proud of. You deny what you don't want other people to see. You deny the things that you're not proud of. So for you to deny something, at some level of your being, you are aware of the truth, but you can't accept it. So you embark on the journey of Saturn. and it beats the living daylights out of you. That's really what it is. It becomes an intense fight. It's like fighting with the devil, whatever that means. Because you're fighting against the aspect of yourself that is very prone to evil machinations, because it's very ignorant on what it is supposed to do and who it is. And yet it is potent with sexual power. Very potent, very strong. And so in investigating or in the process of denial, it runs to all sorts of places. So people with Saturn in Scorpio and people with Saturn in the 8th house, they constantly visit every metaphysical type of situation. They're constantly looking for occultic power. They're constantly looking for spiritual power. They constantly believe that some type of evil force is against them, against their lives. Something is haunting them. Something is after them. And it's always in the form of some type of mysterious hidden energy, but there's nothing really there. What is haunting them is that aspect of themselves that they are denying. You see, because they are born with extremes of sexual behavior, that orgasmic experience, but it doesn't have anywhere to go. That's why the Saturn is in Scorpio. That's why the Saturn is in the 8th house. It doesn't have anywhere to go. So sex is the problem. That's really what it is. The sexual potency of Scorpio cannot be denied. You can find a constructive outlet for it by embracing that hidden part of yourself, coming to terms with the so-called taboo that is buried deep in your nature. That's one way to deal with it. And you must find ways that do not harm others. That's also very hard, because the risks are very real. Don't get me wrong. The reason why the scorpionic experience is difficult is because you are really in danger of some kind. But the danger is not really coming from others. The danger is coming from yourself. Because you are charged with so much spiritual power, sexual power, that you can destroy a lot of things, including yourself. You can destroy others. You can destroy different types of organizations, because that's what that sexual power is. It needs an outlet. And the more constructive the outlet, the better. Otherwise, it begins to investigate all the illicit outlets. That's unbridled sexual behavior, manipulation, abuse of various kinds, including rape, because rape is a violation of sovereignty. But that's exactly what it is. It takes power whenever it wants, however it wants. It doesn't care. And then you trigger the Saturnian corrections. That's why I started with that aspect of the explanation, because you need to understand that it's a loaded spring. And so the Saturn represents a justice of some kind that is applied into the realm of Scorpio, which is applied in the realm of power and sex and money. So the Saturn in the 8th house and the Saturn in Scorpio, these are their challenges. The issue of sex, the issue of power, and the issue of money. Now, when they deny all of this, they may reinterpret themselves as not caring about these things. That's how you know the person is in denial. Because that energy of Scorpio cannot be suppressed. So where is it going? When you deny it in yourself, where is it going? Well, it's poison in the psyche. So the individual is extremely prone to the evil inclinations. And what's that? It always comes from manipulating other people. Being very shrewd. Okay? Because it goes in. And what's Pluto? Pluto rules Scorpio. Pluto is the denizen of that hidden unconscious, that depth that allows an individual to incubate evil. But that's only if they're ignorant. Once they have begun to populate that depth with wisdom and knowledge, then they become very powerful. Okay? If it's filled with ignorance, then they become very destructive, because first of all, they don't know who or what they are. So it's like giving a kid a shotgun. Doesn't know what it is. Thinks it's a toy. Do you imagine the type of destruction that can be caused with that? But that's exactly what we're talking about. Okay? So that this blockage of what Saturn means in the 8th house or in Scorpio, it comes out in various forms when it is being denied, that is. Because it's the epitome of ignorance. So it comes out as shame, guilt, rejection, uncleanliness of some kind. And the uncleanliness itself is always connected to the sexual act. So that when Saturn is in the 8th house or Saturn is in Scorpio, there has always been an incident related to sexuality that has made the individual deny that aspect of themselves. Because, listen, forget what the individual says. When they have Saturn in Scorpio or Saturn in the 8th house, they are brimming with sexual energy. And it is extremely potent. Why? Because it doesn't have anywhere to go. Other placements in Saturn, that functional light becomes a conduit for that sexual expression. It's like Venus in Scorpio, like Mercury in Scorpio. You can use them. Saturn is a denial. It's a blockage. And it accumulates that blockage so that it can be channeled to something, or you can delve into it. It's a journey of some kind. But if you deny all of that, then all of that builds up, but it doesn't stay it must find an outlet. So if you don't see the constructive outlet, then it is investigating or implementing something very terrible. And that's what leads to the shame and the denial even more. Because the individual becomes very ashamed of that part of their life. And they keep it very hidden, such that any attempt, for instance, if the person is engaging in some type of therapy or something, any attempt to open that door will lead to a tremendous lash, a tremendous sting of the scorpion. The individual will become extremely defensive to the point of becoming very dangerous. That's how you know. Because underneath that is a wound, is the primary blockage itself. And it always revolves around sexuality. And when Saturn is in the 8th house or Saturn is in Scorpio, the primary blockage has to do with sexual inadequacy, sexual rejection, or sexual deviation, sexual ridicule. The person's power was taken away from them either through rape or some type of abuse. And it's not something that happened once. It's something that became a pattern, so that the individual blocked off that part of themselves and then they concealed it. Over time, they begin to imagine that it doesn't exist anymore. But this is a band-aid. The dam will eventually burst. So, Saturn in the 8th house and Saturn in Scorpio tells of a time period in the individual's life when reality breaks this dam. Things conspire because that aspect of themselves needs to be healed, because scorpionic forces, plutonic forces, they cannot be denied. They are compulsive, they are obsessive, and they have to do with survival. So we're talking about the mixture of sex and survival. These are very powerful instincts in living things. So nothing in the psyche can withstand the pressure of that. So ultimately it will break. So the life is divided into two parts. Now, they may have a lot of relationships. They may have had relationships in their life. Sexual relationships, etc. No. Their psyche, when it comes to that area of their life, is divided into two compartments. There's a compartment everybody will see and know. And even though it will not be easy, because they are very afraid of all scorpionic themes, betrayal is high on that list. Because these are real dangers when it comes to the Scorpio archetype. Betrayal. Alright? They're very afraid of these things normally. Then there is a no-go area, which not even their parents will be allowed into. Nobody is allowed there. They themselves have blocked that part off. They don't even know that it exists anymore. They have walled it off and sealed it off. And within that aspect of themselves is a seething scorpion. You can say it's a seething viper. It's made up of very complex, emotionally charged, sexually frustrated powers, just waiting to unleash themselves. Now, it is extremely dangerous to just fling the door open, because to destroy the individual, they will go into a crazy spiral of self-destructive behavior. The only way to do it is to open it gradually. But that's easier said than done, because you need to be able to build the trust and the connection with the person. So that in order to love someone with Saturn in Scorpio, especially when Saturn comes to the 8th house, the person is waiting for that. They're waiting for the one who will come into that aspect of themselves, which they don't want anybody in to start with. Some of them have gone so far as they don't even know that it exists anymore. That space is like a hidden room or something. But it contains all the pain, all the memories. And these are very painful memories that if they let out, it can destroy them. Now, if they don't heal that part of themselves, then you are looking at people who are very dangerous. Jealousy, secrets, undermining people, not consciously. You have to understand this. It's not a conscious thing. The most hurt people, the most broken people, when they're unhealed, they become the most dangerous people. Because there is too much pain that cannot be vocalized or verbalized. Someone with Saturn in Scorpio cannot sit down and tell you what these things are. It's impossible. They cannot verbalize these things, because how do you untangle this mess? You can only feel it, and to feel it with someone like that requires courage, because they will sting you, not once, not twice, many, many, many times. You must really love them. You must really, really, really love them to survive that. So that we get to the heart of the matter, that what the Saturn in Scorpio is really waiting for, what the Saturn in the 8th house is really waiting for, is true love, the truest of love. Now, because because of the emotionally closed aspect of themselves. The only way to verify the authenticity of that true love is to put it through the worst of all things. Terrible. And it takes time. Now, no rational person wants to do this based on just wanting to hang around, or based on people who have very superficial or topical notions of what love is. They will never cross that barrier. These are not easy things. These are painful things. So that the Saturn in Scorpio, or the Saturn in the 8th house, when you find such people in long-term stable relationships, it's one of two things. Either the partner doesn't ever bother to get to that aspect of themselves, and in that case, that Saturn in Scorpio in that relationship, or that Saturn in that 8th house, they cannot be faithful to that partner because doesn't care. So they have come into some type of arrangement where they're happy to live with the evolved structure. Or they are in that type of relationship where the partner has been able to cross that boundary, and then they are different. Such a love relationship, such a bond, when you see it, you will know it. The depth of it is beyond description. There are no verbal words for that depth. If that partner dies, the other person will die very quickly, because they are no longer, in the sense, two different people. They have become like one person, even though they're two people. But the depth of connection is beyond the verbal expression of words. There's an emotional pontoon now that connects both people together. And this is very difficult to achieve because we're all individual people with our different sovereignties and all that. But that's what the Saturn in Scorpio is looking for. That's what the Saturn in the 8th house is really looking for. But it requires the utmost of courage. To love these people is not for the faint-hearted at all. Because they will try to harm you. They will undermine you. They will fight you. They will try to undo you. Because your ability to trigger them in that way, to open those doors, to make them face the worst memories of their lives, which may also include death, because that's the ultimate powerless situation. The death of loved ones, or something was taken away from them that plunged them into extreme forms of powerlessness, and they remained in that situation for a very long time, completely helpless. The only way for them to move on was to seal that place away, or that thing away, and then to forget about it. And then you come and you try to open that because you want to reach to the depth of them. They will fight you. They will go against you. They will try to harm you in various ways, including hidden ways. Now, if they're able to succeed in destroying you, they will rationalize that as saying, well, it wasn't real anyway. Because this is an ability they have learned how to do, to rationalize things. They rationalize themselves. Listen, they feel within that aspect of themselves, they feel every human foible you can imagine. Every human form of weakness. From jealousy to betrayal to lies to all sorts of things. They feel it within themselves. That's what happens when the psyche is poisoned to that level. They have to block all of that away. Because you will never meet any one of them that tells you that, oh, I have the powerful evil inclination. No, of course not. They couldn't survive with that. So they go into denial. Extreme forms of denial. So when you are dealing with someone with Saturn in Scorpio, Saturn in the 8th house, you have to be very careful. You're dealing with people who can be set off by a simple thing, That's why I say that you genuinely have to want to love them. You genuinely have to be in love with them. Now, how that happens, take a guess, right? It happens patiently. You must be willing to suffer with them, because the union between Scorpio and Saturn is felt like some type of asphyxiation. You know what asphyxiation is? Good explanation for asphyxiation is drowning. It's one of the most horrible ways to die, because you're literally suffocating and then you suffocate. It's like being strangled. That's exactly what it feels like. The individual feels like they are suffocating. It's almost like the walls are constantly closing in. And that's why I started this narrative the way that I did. Because that's the effect of that Saturn. And anything in Scorpio, or anything conjunct Pluto or aspected to Pluto in a very powerful way, it is accentuated. It is elevated because now it is connected to survival and sexual instincts. And that gives it a very powerful expression in your psyche. Now, sometimes the expression is so powerful, nobody wants to confront that, so they bury it. But that's the worst thing you can do, because you bury it, you give it power over your unconscious, and it begins to operate in ways that you are not conscious of. And it's always very self-destructive. The solution is to find outlets. Outlets. Alright? And one of the important outlets is when you know that intimate bonds are really being established, is that the individual begins to feel freer and more trustworthy with the partner in order to express what they really like sexually. And Yeah. They are sexual monsters in that sense. But not monstrosity in a bad way. They have huge sexual appetites. Because these are things that have been walled off, blocked off for a very long time. So imagine trying to drive your automobile or your vehicle with just 2 wheels instead of 4. You can imagine the type of damage that is being done if you try to do that. But that's exactly what these people have to deal with. There's a lot of their psyche that is just being totally damaged. Now, healing that part requires that they're able to open up about this. This is not something that is easy for them. It is very hard because it requires confronting what they fear the most. It's deeper than that. They have to confront betrayal and denial. They have to confront the aspects of themselves that are very secretive, very prone to jealousy and envy. And when they're jealous and envious of someone, they will try to harm the person in one way or the other. Now, these are not conscious things. Why? They will imagine scenarios where the person is trying to harm them, so they have to act first. I need you to understand that this pattern of expression in the psyche is very dangerous. It's as dangerous to the individual as it is to others. Now, when they are in denial mode, then you have to thread very carefully. Because even though they don't want to hurt you, self-defense, the survival instinct and the sexual instinct is very powerful. It is autonomic, meaning you don't need your will to be able to execute it. It is unconscious. And people think that dysfunctional people know that they're dysfunctional. They don't. That's not the narrative they tell themselves. In order to sustain yourself in a dysfunctional state, you have to convince yourself that you are not dysfunctional. And that usually happens in the form of a narrative. So every Saturn in the 8th house or Saturn in Scorpio, they have an operational narrative which they tell themselves about the way that the world is towards them. When you examine that narrative, you will find all the adjustments that have been made so that they can accommodate who they are in the denial state. This is what it is. Now, the upside of this placement, Saturn in Scorpio and Saturn in the 8th house, is that if you are lucky enough to survive this intimate contact with these people, one of them actually opens up to you to be able to love you. Now, once that happens, they will love you forever. That's the whole point. They will love you forever with the same type of reflexive automatic action that they try to undo you. Okay? Now, if that's what you're really looking for and you find one of these people and you survive the contact to reach the promised land, then what you have is, let's put it this way, you will never really need to look for sex elsewhere with anybody else. They are more than enough. They have enough for you across several lifetimes. They will encompass you. They will internalize you. They will consume you sexually. You have never felt anything like that before. You have never experienced anything like that before. Now, this is very different from the type of sexual contacts they have for what can only be described as their denial state. Because they may go through the motion of what intimacy means. Oh, I love you, I care, kiss, and all that. It's not real. It's a construct that they have put up in order to be able to hide that part of themselves that they're not even aware of anymore. It's not real. If you ask them what it really means, they don't know. Most of them ultimately can walk away from such things. Saturn in the 8th house and Saturn in Scorpio, they can't walk away from relationships that they are really intimate in. They love you forever. So what is walking away? If you walk away from them, they die. That's really what it is. It's not a small placement. It comes with a lot of baggage and a lot of gifts. So it is an invitation to grow up. It's an invitation to cross over the chasm of what that Scorpio experience is. To gain mastery in that field, which is to cure the ignorance. That is, there is nothing in that Scorpio experience that becomes unknown anymore. The individual feels it all. They come to experience it all. They come to understand it all. And what awakens in them is the nature of that orgasmic experience. The truth of it. So that these are the people that become sages. Very, very wise in human affairs. Very understand with a depth and a broad vision, because they can see into the very heart of human motives, all the spectrum of it all, how it emerges. So you try lying to this type of person after they have become healed. You are dealing with someone who's spiritually very, very elevated once they have become healed. And that satisfies the Scorpio, because what the Scorpio is really looking for is they want to understand this thing that came into this reality with them, which is largely unknown to them anymore. They don't know what that orgasmic experience is anymore. They don't know the condition it existed in prior to when they were born. They don't know what the other feels like anymore, and yet they cannot be without the other. That conundrum ultimately gets resolved in the healed Saturn in Scorpio or Saturn in the 8th house. So for those of you who really relish the idea of true love, find you a Saturn in the 8th house or Saturn in Scorpio, and then you have to be genuine. You have to be honest, absolutely honest. You have to be honest about whether you love them or not, because if you don't, you won't survive it. You will run for the hills at the first few signs of what looks like some type of craziness or insanity of some kind. Because you're dealing with someone they're not themselves. They exist in a reality system that they literally conjure up. When you listen to it, you know that there's something wrong with this person's way of seeing the world. It's just off in a sense, but that's a coping mechanism. That's not all they are. When the Saturn in Scorpio or Saturn in the 8th house is by themselves, if these walls come down, then what you have is an individual in tremendous pain. Part of the pain is that nobody understands. They don't even understand. So they're swamped with confusion and doubt and shame and denial and all sorts of things. Envy, jealousy, anger, rage. They're seething underneath. That's the sexual energy that doesn't have anywhere to go. They're envious of everything and everyone. Don't let anybody deceive you. Even they will, even they will say, oh no, that's not the case. That's not true. The envy burns deep within them because they feel very rejected. It's like, I told you, something was taken away from them. Something that you should never take from a human being. Their sovereignty. Through one way or the other, it was forcefully taken away from them. And that created a very powerful impact on their psyche. And that now begins the journey. Okay?